Sometimes love arrives in the simplest forms: a smile, a warm touch, or a silence that understands. This is the story of a paralyzed mother-in-law named Zina and her son-in-law Zico, two hearts brought together by fate in an unusual way. A story about loving without needing many words. Welcome to a tale of a hand that never lets go. The evening sky was gray, as if it had absorbed all the colors from the world below. Rain began to fall gently, like a whisper without voice. Inside a large colonial-style house on the outskirts of the city, a woman sat quietly in her wheelchair, her eyes fixed on the fogged window. Her name was Zina. She was 45, though the fine lines on her face made her appear slightly older. She was beautiful in a calm, understated way. Long black hair touched with strands of silver, tired brown eyes, and lips that seemed to hold an unfinished story. 2 years earlier, Zina had been in a car accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, her life had felt frozen in time. Her husband had died 5 years before, and her only daughter, Rallin, now lived abroad with her new husband, a young man named Zico. But life took another unexpected turn. Raylan received a job offer she couldn't refuse, so she asked Zico to stay behind and take care of her mother, who couldn't move without help. Zico agreed, and from that moment on, the once quiet house was filled with just two souls, Zina and Zico. Zico was 25, tall with calm eyes that reminded Zina of her younger days. There was a gentleness in everything he did. Since moving in, he cared for Zina patiently, helping her from bed to wheelchair each morning, preparing breakfast, keeping her company with quiet conversations or reading. He never complained. He simply did what was needed. Zina often watched him from the corner of her eye, silently noting how carefully he combed his hair, how he would bring her a shawl when the air grew cold, or softly play classical music in the late afternoon. A quiet comfort began to grow in Zina's heart. Not a burning passion, but a slow, steady warmth that gently filled the empty spaces within her. She had started to look forward to the quiet knock on her door each morning, the soft clinking of spoons and glasses from the kitchen, the gentle voice of Zico asking, "Would you like to sit in the garden today, Mother?" One morning, when the sun still refused to come out from behind the clouds, Zico entered Zina's room carrying a small tray with jasmine, tea, and triangle-cut toast. "Are you awake, Mother?" he asked softly. Zina smiled. "Since the rain started early this morning, weather like this reminds me of my childhood." Zico gently wheeled her chair toward the large window, then sat on a long wooden bench to the left side of the room. "Do you like the rain?" he asked. "I do, especially when it's calm like this, not rushing." Zico nodded, his eyes gazing out the window. "I like it too. It feels like everything heavy inside the chest seeps into the earth." Zina turned slightly to look at her son-in-law's face. He was still so young, full of life, a man who should be out in the world living a vibrant life, and yet here he was, choosing to stay and care for her, a middle-aged woman who could barely move beyond her hands and head. "Zico," she whispered. "Yes, Mother? Aren't you tired of taking care of me like this?" Zico frowned slightly, then smiled. "No, Mother. I like it here. It's peaceful. And you're kind." Zina looked down, her heart beating with something she didn't quite understand. She wanted to say, "I'm not kind. I'm often angry, easily moody, and sometimes I envy women who can walk freely." But she couldn't bring herself to say it. "You know," she finally said, "if you ever have free time, you can go out, meet friends, take a walk. I'm comfortable here, Mother." That answer made Zina's heart feel like a single leaf falling gently onto still water, floating calmly, but hiding deep currents beneath. Days passed in a silence that felt like an embrace. And from that silence, something began to grow. Something neither of them could explain. Zina began smiling more often. She started writing little poems again, ones she had abandoned long ago. She even asked Zico to find her an old poetry book by Kil Anwar, a book she used to read with her late husband. 2 days later, Zico brought it to her. "This book is no longer in print," he said, handing it to her with a smile. "I found it in a second-hand bookstore." The worn-covered book rested on Zina's lap. She touched it gently, as if her fingers were brushing against a long-dead memory. Her eyes lingered on Zico, and after a moment she said softly, "You know, since you came, this house feels alive again." Zico looked slightly surprised, then lowered his gaze. "I'm just trying to help the best I can, Mother." "But you've done more than you realize." A few seconds of silence followed, filled only by the breeze carrying the scent of wet earth, and morning rain through the window. And in that stillness, something shifted inside Zena. Not a foreign feeling, but something buried long ago. Not longing, not quite love, but a deep human need for someone's presence. That night, as the rain fell once again, Zena was jolted awake by a nightmare. She felt as if she were back in that overturned car, hearing the screech of metal, feeling the terror of being unable to move. But the sharpest pain of all was the loneliness that had followed. Her hand trembled as she reached for the call button. Moments later, the door opened. Zico entered, wearing a thin sweater and pajama pants. "Mother, what's wrong?" "Another bad dream?" Zena tried to hold back a sob. "I'm sorry, I don't want to be alone tonight." Zico sat at the edge of her bed and gently took her hand. "I'm here, Mother. I'm not going anywhere." That night, they didn't talk much. Zico simply stayed beside her until she drifted back to sleep. And just before her eyes closed, Zena thought, maybe I'll never be able to tell him how much I've started to miss him, more than I should. But in this slow silence, something is growing, not love in fireworks or loud declarations, but in a quiet tremble, like the first rain touching old leaves at the beginning of the rainy season. And Zena knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The morning air was thick with dew, and sunlight streamed softly through the gaps in the curtains, dancing across the wooden floor. The scent of jasmine tea still lingered, a trace of warmth from earlier mornings filled with quiet conversations between Zena and Zico. Now, their days flowed in a peaceful rhythm. Unspoken, gentle, and steady, and almost without pause. There were no arguments, no noise, just two souls of different ages, learning to understand each other through glances, smiles, and silences full of meaning. That morning, Zico opened Zena's door, carrying something unusual, a small bundle of fresh jasmine flowers tucked into a delicate glass vase. "Good morning, Mother," he greeted her, his voice softer than usual. Zena turned from her wheelchair and smiled silently. Her gaze fell on the flowers in Zico's hands, and something sweet and unfamiliar seemed to gently carve its way into her chest. "For me?" she asked softly. Zico nodded and placed the vase on the small table near the window. "I passed through the back garden this morning. The jasmine had just bloomed. It felt wrong not to pick some, for someone who loves their fragrance." Zena didn't reply. She only stared at the tiny white blossoms, then turned her eyes to the window. "Jasmine is like memory," she murmured. "Soft, but it can make us cry if we remember too long." Zico sat on the wooden bench beside her. "Do you like memories, Mother?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to forget everything, but another part wants to hold them tightly, even if they hurt." Zico nodded slowly. "Maybe it's because in memories, we can still love without limits, even when the person is no longer here." Zena fell silent. Her heart trembled. His words touched something she had long locked away. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a deep cliff, not afraid of falling, but afraid of losing the sunlight that now fell gently on Zico's face. In the days that followed, their bond grew warmer. Zico began reading poetry to her in the afternoons, his calm voice becoming a new rhythm in Zena's life, a life that had once known only the ticking of clocks and the sound of her own breath. One afternoon, rain came without warning. In the living room, Zena sat facing the small garden behind the house, and Zico sat on the floor, reading poetry by Sapardi Jocodamino. "I want to love you in a simple way, with words unspoken, like the wood that never tells the fire. It will become ash." Zena closed her eyes, as if trying to etch the sound of Zico's voice deep into the corners of her heart. "Zico," she whispered, as the poem ended. "Yes, Mother?" She looked at his face. "Why are you so patient?" Zico was quiet for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Maybe because I don't want to rush through life. Some of the most beautiful things come slowly, from small, quiet moments." Zena bit her lower lip. She wanted to tell him that he wasn't just patient. He was sincere, that his presence didn't just fill a space, but healed wounds she had long hidden beneath her wrinkles and graying hair. But those words stayed within her. She couldn't speak the feelings that were growing inside her, like wildflowers, unruly but beautiful. A few weeks later, Zico invited Zena outside to enjoy the late afternoon in the small garden behind the house. He gently pushed her wheelchair along the path, still damp from last night's rain. The sky above was a pale blue, and the air carried the scent of soil and leaves. "This place," Zena whispered. "My husband and I used to sit here in the afternoons, but it never felt this peaceful." Zico didn't answer. He simply nodded and sat on the long bench beside her wheelchair. "Do you miss Raylan?" Zena asked, daring to touch something they had both avoided. Zico looked up at the sky. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "Sometimes yes, but lately I feel like I miss something I can't even name." Zena understood. The feeling that had grown between them had never been given a name. She didn't know if what she felt was love or simply the comfort of not being alone. But every time Zico was near, the world felt complete. And that alone made her days brighter. That night, after Zico had taken her to her room and made sure everything she needed was within reach, he turned to leave. But Zena called his name. "Zico." He turned back. "Yes, Mother?" She looked at him deeply. "Thank you for making me feel alive again." Zico stood silent for a moment. There was a subtle trembling in his eyes that he couldn't hide. "No, I'm the one who should thank you. You've shown me that beauty can still be found, even in silence." They looked at each other in stillness. No further words, no movement closer. But in their gaze, something clung quietly. Not desire, not aching longing, but understanding, as if two souls had finally found a place to rest. And the night fell around them, embracing them in its warm, quiet dark. The sky in June hung heavy, its gray tones stealing the warmth from every corner. Rain fell nearly every afternoon, leaving behind the soothing scent of earth. In that old house, the rainy season brought more than droplets on the roof. It brought slower time and a vanishing of distance between two hearts, learning to listen in silence. Zena sat near the large window, a blanket covering her lifeless legs. In her hands, an old book of Rendra's poetry, its pages yellowed with age. She wasn't reading, only staring, lost in the space between memory and presence. It was as if the answer to a question she'd never dared to ask was hidden between those worn pages. From the kitchen came the soft clinking of dishes and silverware, followed by footsteps. Zico entered the living room, carrying a cup of hot chocolate and some biscuits he had baked himself. "You're still awake, Mother?" he asked. She shook her head with a faint smile. "The sky's just too noisy tonight." Zico chuckled softly and placed the cup on the table. "Hot chocolate," he said. "They say it helps you sleep better." Zena accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. "Nights like this often remind me of my childhood," she murmured. "My mother used to sing to me before bed." "What kind of song?" "A Javanese lullaby," she replied. "Slow and soft, like a prayer that never truly ends." Zico gazed at her face bathed in the amber glow of the lamp. Beneath the lines of age and the frailty of her body, there was a serenity few people ever possessed. Zena wasn't an easy woman to approach, but through their shared silences and quiet conversations, he had come to understand why his heart leaned toward hers. Not out of pity, but out of a quiet admiration, a longing that had grown unnoticed. "If you don't mind," Zico said gently, "may I read you a poem tonight?" Zena smiled. "Go ahead, but nothing too beautiful, I might fall in love." Zico held back a smile and opened the small book in his hands. Soft verses flowed from his lips, his voice low and deep, wrapping the night in an invisible blanket. Zena listened calmly, her heart growing lighter, as if she were no longer the paralyzed woman bound by her past, but simply a woman who longed for warmth, to be seen, heard, and valued. When the poem ended, Zico looked at her. "That poem was about love that comes without a name," he said. Zena nodded slowly, "And sometimes without direction, but it comes anyway." She chuckled quietly. "You're becoming dangerous, Zico." Zico smiled but didn't reply. He only looked at her for a moment, then stood. "Let me take these cups, Mother. Get some rest." As he walked away, Zena watched his back, feeling something stir inside her that she couldn't quite name. She knew the boundaries between them were clear. Age, titles, and the past couldn't simply be erased. But she also knew that whatever had taken root in her heart was no longer something she could control. A few days later, Zico quietly left a small gift on the table. A soft blue shawl, folded neatly beside a handwritten note. "For Mother, so the nights won't feel too cold." Zena read the note while holding the shawl close to her chest, her heart pounding faster than usual. She could no longer deny it. She had fallen for him, not as a son-in-law, but for the sincerity that lived in his every gesture.